My name is Chris Brookes, and I am the outreach coordinator for Black Point Estate, which means bringing programs out into the communities. I'm from a 6th generation Walworth County family, born and raised in Lake Geneva. Some people are a little more familiar with the lake than others, but you may have on your boat trip, or if you walked around the lake, heard of Northwestern Military Academy that was on the lake for 80 years. And my father was the headmaster there. So I grew up on that campus with 180 brothers every year or so. And so
I bet you were very well behaved having the father who was in charge of.
Yes, and he was an Episcopal priest too.
Oh,
goodness. Yeah, right under the thumb. But I've grown up in Lake Geneva, went to school there, and I'm just thrilled to be part of the Black Point Estate Speakers Bureau because this is my home and I love it, and I love history, and I'm involved with a lot of history and genealogical organizations. So I'm bringing this tonight because it is Women's History Month. Did you know that March was Women's History Month? It is. And so I have a question for you. When do you think Women's History Month started? Do you think it was in the 20s, the 40s, or the 80s?
80s.
The 80s. Oh, you all are so smart. So smart. So it was, surprisingly, not until 1987, I need this, that Women's History Month was actually proclaimed. Friday is International Women's History Day, and that was started by the United Nations back in 1975. And a couple years later, an activist group out in Sonoma, California decided to revise their school curriculum to recognize some of the achievements of women. So that program went along for a couple more years, and in 1978, they celebrated Women's History Week. President Jimmy Carter proclaimed the first National Women's History Week in 1980. But it still was an on-again, off-again thing. You had to wait for the proclamation from the Congress until finally in 1987. Congress declared March National Women's History Month in perpetuity, which is one of my favorite words, perpetuity. There is also a National Women's Hall of Fame, and that was started in 1969 in Seneca Falls, New York, which is the birth of the Women's Rights Convention. So tonight when you hear about the remarkable women of Geneva Lake, you'll have to decide if you think some of them, if it had been in existence, would have qualified for the Women's History Hall of Fame. And you said you had been on a boat trip around the lake. Yep. So maybe you remember some of it or not, but mostly, if you haven't been on that trip, what you do hear is the stories of all the men, what they invented, how they made their money. And some people got to wondering, what were the women doing while the men were all out in the business world and so forth? Well, I'm here to tell you they were doing a lot more than sitting on the veranda drinking tea. We have around our Geneva Lake remarkable Native Americans, pioneer women. I think we have the original cheesehead. And women that gave to charity, were philanthropists, social reformers, suffragettes and suffragists. There is a difference, and of course that's going to come up in the next few years as we talk about the women's right to vote. And we have travelers and athletes and even human computers. So here we go. We'll start with the Native Americans. And they were most recently on the lake as the Potawatomi tribe. And the Potawatomis, men, all did the hunting and fishing. The women did the farming and raised the children. So they did almost everything else. And there, as we go around the lake, we are going to use some maps as we go. If you're not familiar with Geneva Lake, this is Lake Geneva up here, the largest community on the lake. This is Williams Bay, and this is Fontana on the west end of the lake. Fontana is the area where Chief Bigfoot of the Potawatomis had his royal camp. But he had his community garden over here in Williams Bay. And it was the women that were doing the gardening. So a group of women would leave Royal Camp, they would follow the lakeshore around, and they would stay at the gardens for a couple of weeks at the garden camp and work the land. And then when their time was up, they would walk back to the camp and another group of women would walk over. And I don't have documentation for this, but I really think that that's how the Lakeshore Path got started. Because they just wore this path into the shoreline year after year after year. They had a unique way of farming in that, well, it was different than the way the Americans farmed, because primarily their crops were corn, beans, and squash. And they would take all the seeds and plant them together. Just mix them together. Because when the corn grew up, it provided a stalk for the bean vines to grow. The beans added nitrogen to the soil. And when the squash spread out across the land, we had moisture for the roots and keep the weeds away. So very, very intelligent, remarkable women were gardening for the Potawatomis. In 1831, something unusual happened. A family from Chicago, which at that time was Fort Winnebago, the Kinseys, John and Juliet Kinsey, were traveling from Fort Winnebago through Wisconsin up to Portage, where Fort Winnebago was established. Fort Winnebago and Fort Dearborn. John Kinsey was an Indian agent, so he knew all the tribes, he knew a lot of the leaders of the tribes and so forth, and about 4 days out from Chicago, they came to this beautiful, clear lake. They were the first white people, is the way the history books write it, the first Europeans to come through here and record the lake. So over by Fontana, fairly near the Royal Camp, they stopped, they camped, they saw the lake. Juliet kept a diary, and she wrote down all about Chief Bigfoot, whom she called an ugly, raw-boned Indian. But he turned out to be very nice. He took them back to his camp. He introduced them to the women that were gardening. They learned all these new methods of gardening and saw the Royal Camp. So Juliet wrote about it, and from then on, other people began to try and find the lake. If they found it, they wanted to settle. And at that point in time was when the government was making an offer to the Native Americans to buy their land and move them, remove them from the Royal Camp and from the garden, and probably send them, well, they said somewhere similar to the lake, send them to Kansas. Even partway to Kansas, some of the Potawatomi people were coming back, leaving the train and going back to their home. But Juliet Kinsey and her husband really opened up the lake for settlers.
Can you please spell that last name?
Kinsey, K-I-N-Z-I-E.
We have a street in Racine, Kinsey Avenue.
And I'm sure it's for them.
Oh.
John Kinsey's father was the first white man to build a settlement outside of Fort Dearborn. He had a little store, general store. And he was an Indian agent as well, and this is his son, Major Kinsey, who followed in his footsteps as an Indian agent. And they came right through here, so very easily. So one of the first settlers to come into the area was a woman by the name of Catherine Van Slyke. I think she's pretty remarkable because she was very, very resilient. Her husband was not around very often. It seemed like just when she needed him, he was gone. Like when she was pregnant, and he left. And in the next log cabin over was a young boy of 14 years old that served as her midwife when she delivered her daughter, who we thought was Geneva Van Slyke. I looked all over the place for information on Geneva Van Slyke. Turns out her mother Catherine had named her Charlotte. Come to find out, Charlotte Van Slyke had a lot of information. She had also the name Geneva because she had a second christening. There was a man in Lake Geneva that ran the mill, became friends with the Van Slyks, and decided to honor little baby, the first white child born in the area, with a new name. He had a second christening. He named her himself, called her Geneva. And so she's recorded her birth as Charlotte. They called her Geneva. He gave her a present of a little plot of land. And until I realized she had the first name Catherine, I couldn't find her. But once I did, I found that she died young. She never married. She's buried in the Brookes Cemetery churchyard in Walden, Wisconsin. Right near her mother and grandmother. The little daughter. The little daughter next to
Her
her
name
mom.
is Catherine?
The mom was Catherine.
Mom's Catherine.
The baby was Charlotte.
Charlotte.
Renamed Geneva.
Okay.
Yeah, renamed Geneva.
After the lake, or does this precede the naming of the lake?
The lake was named, yes,
Oh, okay.
and Mr. Warren was living in the community of Geneva, Wisconsin,
Okay.
the village of Geneva. So this being the first baby born, he thought she should have that name.
Do you know what the Indian name for the lake was?
Yes, Kishwaukito. It means clear water. It also was called Lake Bigfoot after the chief of the Potawatomis, but originally Kishwaukito. I'll tell you one more story about Catherine, what a resilient woman she was. The winter of 1836-37 was particularly severe, and in February, her unreliable husband decided that he would go off with another man and herd hogs back across the Bigfoot Prairie. It was bitter cold. It was probably a polar vortex like this. And about 4 miles from home, they just couldn't stand it any longer. It was so cold. They just abandoned the herd of swine, and they did everything they could just to make it home. Now the neighbor and the other man that went with Mr. Van Slyke was by the name of Nathan Disbrow. He was frozen. His feet were frozen. And they got to the cabin, and Mrs. Van Slyke, what a woman, she took out her sewing shears and her butcher knife. She amputated his toes, and he lived. What a woman, right? Now, one of our other communities on the lake is Williams Bay. That was named for Israel Williams and his family. But his wife, I like to think of as the first cheesehead in southeastern Wisconsin. When she got to Wisconsin and they set up their home on Williams Bay, the first year that they were here, 1838, she made 800 pounds of cheese.
Wow.
And she transported them from Williams Bay into the town of Geneva so that they could be sold all winter at the general store. So she was a pretty special woman to take on that task of 800 pounds of cheese. She sold it for 1 shilling a pound. And so if you think about it, shillings are British coins. We were still the Northwest Territory. We didn't have in 1838 our own coinage, really. Now, many of these women that we're talking about made their mark, became remarkable, much before women got the vote. And as I say, we're going to be talking a lot about the women getting the vote in 2020, an anniversary. But just to put some other things in perspective, in the 1890s, which is what the era we'll talk about most tonight, in a divorce, men got the children and the property. So it was up to the women to keep the family together if she wanted to stay with her children and not divorce. What kind of work could she be doing in 1890 or so? If she had any education at all, she probably was a teacher or a secretary, possibly a nurse. But otherwise, if you didn't have much education, you worked in a factory if you were in a large city, or in domestic service, especially when the bigger estates started to appear on Geneva Lake right after the Chicago fire. The wealthy women had their own role too. Some of them were college educated, but not very many at that point in time. They could do some social reform. They could stop there if they wanted to, because, well, their wealth depended on the men, and they didn't want to rock the boat for the men in any business. But we're going to talk about women that were more of an exception. As we come back to the maps, here's Geneva, the village of Geneva, and the first few women we're going to talk about are right here along the north shore. And so I'll talk about these, this group of women, because this was really the first part of the lake that was settled. As you came in on the train from Chicago after the Chicago fire, you'd end up here. The only transportation was really available was on the boats. So they hugged the shore, and they continued to develop the lake from there. The first woman is Mary Delafield Sturgis. And I have a special feeling for Mary Delafield Sturgis. I don't think any of you were here about a year and a half ago, but I was invited here to do a program for your friends of the library, and I came as Mary Sturgis. I sometimes portray historical women in costume and tell the story of how she survived the Chicago fire and so forth. This was her first home, right on Main Street along the shore. Sorry. And she ended up, after she arrived here from the fire with 4 children. They ended up with 8 children in this little house before they built a bigger house. And so she had 1 more child in the big house. And what was she going to do with this little cottage? She donated it in 1894 to become Lake Geneva's first library. And so if you come and visit the library in Lake Geneva, now it's a modern Frank Lloyd Wright type prairie-style building with a plaque on the front of the building explaining about Mary Sturgis and her little white cottage that she donated. Her daughter Ethel Sturgis lived just up the road at a place that she called the Orchards. And so she became very well educated. This was the big house that they built on the lakeshore. They called it Snug Harbor, with all their 8 children plus 1 more. It was very snug. Only had, I don't know, 13 bedrooms or so. And so it was snug. And Mary made sure that the little cottage became the library. Ethel's, Mary's daughter, was recognized as being one of the leading sociologists in the whole country for child labor reform. She helped unwed mothers keep their children with government support. She set up pilot schools in the early 1900s in Chicago, and she worked with Jane Addams at Hull House. In fact, she established the University of Chicago School of Social Work with Jane Addams in 1908. The Sturgis, this was George Sturgis, and he had other brothers that came and settled in Lake Geneva as well. Shelton Sturgis was the first one. He lived just up the shore. And then Albert Sturgis and Buckingham Sturgis had farms and other places. So this family was very, very influential in establishing the Chicago community on Geneva Lake. One of the other people that came up to the lake was Raynette Lester McCrae. She was a very strong suffragette. And a suffragette is the kind of woman who advocated for women's suffrage, for the right to vote, very, very actively, with rallies and informational meetings, and if they ran across a suffragist who was a person that sided with them but wasn't out there on the front lines supporting, but they still reinforced the idea of women's suffrage. She also took to the campaign trail herself in 1910 to get women's right to vote. and she was an environmentalist. You might not think about women in 1890 or so being conscious the way we are of the environment today. But she had huge gardens, and she helped to form the Lake Geneva Garden Club. She brought children from the schools out to her house to see the fish and the flora and the fauna and the wildlife and the birds, and teach them about the care of the lake and the environment. This is her home, Black Toft, and like I say, if you've been to Lake Geneva and you know where the Riviera is, right downtown where you get the boats, across the street is a park called Flatiron Park, where there's a little Chamber of Commerce building, and there's a statue of 3 women, the 3 graces of Greek mythology. They're called Beauty, Charm, and Joy. And they stand on a pedestal with the names of Renette Lester McCrae's 10 best friends around the lake. One of them was Mary Sturgis. And today, there's a little fountain that is supposedly Renette's wish to have man or beast get a cooling drink on a hot day. She left $5,000 in her will to have that statue created after she was gone. Frances Hutchinson was another environmentalist and an avid gardener. She believed in keeping the natural landscape. Many, many of these homes all had Victorian, very laid out formal gardens. But Frances and her husband had no children. They built their estate called Witchwood, right here, with a second story that was all covered in vines eventually. There were berries and plants around the estate that would attract birds and animals. She also had a little feeding station for birds right outside her bedroom window. And apparently she had a male cardinal come to the windowsill for the bird feeder, day after day after day. She never saw a female cardinal. So she put an ad or a letter to the editor in the paper asking for a wife for Mr. Cardinal. And someone answered the ad. From Lincoln Park, I think, a conservatory near Chicago, said, "We have a female cardinal. If you would like to bring your bird cage down on the train, we'd be glad to give her to you." So Frances did. She went down on the train with the bird cage. They said, "Well, you know, this is not an American cardinal. This is a Mexican cardinal. She's larger than the breeds we have here." Frances took it anyway, came home on the train, put the bird cage right on her windowsill, and Mr. Cardinal would come and feed. They'd probably talk amongst themselves, you know. I don't think language was a barrier. And then eventually she opened the door to the bird cage. Mrs. Cardinal hopped out. The 2 of them flew up across the lake, and, well, we've had cardinals ever since. But Frances and her husband, when they designed the estate, they took strings and stakes and laid out the house that they wanted, and if too many trees had to come down, they would move the strings and stakes until they were able to not destroy too many trees. When her husband died and they had no children, she decided at her demise she would donate 75 acres to the University of Chicago as a wildlife refuge and a study center and an endowment for 25 years to keep it going. Now we still have this house on the lake, but it's only, I'm going to back up here, it's only 1 story. It's a 1-story ranch because all of this was not heated, and with all of the vines that grew on the house, the top floor just rotted away. And so there is the foundation and the first floor still, and it's part of the Wrigley estate. There is a Garden Club of America award given annually in Frances' memory. It's one of the highest honors that the Garden Club of America bestows. Some figures of national importance for conservation who have won this in the past were Rachel Carson, Walt Disney, Lady Bird Johnson and Roger Torrey Peterson. If you took the boat trip, you've seen this house. And it's memorable. It's called House in the Woods, and it was built for A.C. Bartlett and his family. A.C. Bartlett started True Value Hardware. And his first wife gave him 4 children and passed away. His second wife, Abby, was the woman he came to the lake with and built this house. Abby's birthday was coming. He didn't quite know what to give her. But she was many years younger than he was, and she was very spunky and enthusiastic, and he wanted to do something really special. Her birthday was in the spring. He decided to build her a house on the lake. But so much construction was going on that fall that they couldn't get to it. So he rented circus tents from the Barnum Circus that wintered in Delavan, Wisconsin. And the whole house was built under circus tents. So that in spring, when it was Abby's birthday, whoosh, there was her gift. So it was designated by Ladies' Home Journal in 1909 as one of the most beautiful country houses in the nation. Florence was one of his daughters by his first marriage, and she was a supporter in Chicago of a group called the Eleanor Club. The Eleanor Club was for working women, and they didn't have that much, not high salaries. If they wanted to go on vacation or anything, they had to have chaperones at that point in time. And so Florence and some of her friends got together and decided they could build an Eleanor camp on Geneva Lake and have a nice, inexpensive place for women to come, and where they would not have to be chaperoned. So on our lake, we have Eleanor Camp, which is right in the middle. And the last house we talked about, House on the Lake, is right about here. So up the lake, just past Williams Bay, was Eleanor Camp. Camp Augustana is here. Some of you might have heard of that or come to Camp Augustana as a child. And this is Holiday Home that we'll spend some time with as well. Eleanor Camp had the obvious activities on the lake, swimming and everything. They also had the girls live in tents, but these were the tents. They weren't the rustic tents. On the outside, they fit in with the environment very, very well. But on the inside, they were pretty luxurious. They had floor coverings, they had shawls and table coverings and books and a kerosene lamp and their little bed over in the corner. This was real luxury for these secretaries and women from the cities that came up to spend the time in the summer on vacation. So in mentioning the camps, I just will say a couple things about this is Camp Augustana, and almost all of them were for families. They just had the 2 that were for women. The previous camp, Florence, for Eleanor Camp was the first one. And again, Camp Augustana has a waterfront and everything, but who do you think took care of the camps? The men probably started them, but it was the women and the families that kept them going. They had to do all of the work, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, and making up the beds, and they did everything behind the scenes. Agnes Allerton lived on an estate called the Folly. The way the men sometimes found the land that they wanted to build on was by walking the lake path. And Sam Allerton walked up from the village of Lake Geneva, or the village of Geneva, and saw this property on a point that came out into the narrows of the lake. And there was a little redwood fishing cottage on the land. And he thought he'd like to enlarge that cottage, and he'd like to have that piece of land. So he bought it. And he came home and he told Agnes he bought a little redwood fishing cottage on Geneva Lake. And she said, "Oh, Sam, that is such a folly." So they named their house House the Folly. Almost all the mansions around the lake have very special and meaningful names. So that's the enlargement of the little fishing cottage on Geneva Lake. Agnes was quite a woman in her own right. She knew that up the road was a little community called the Irish Woods. And she knew that most of the help in the estates, on the grounds or in the houses, were the Irish. They had been brought to Geneva during the days the railroad was being built. The railroad went bankrupt and the company left the people there. No severance, no salary, no transportation, just said, well, we're bankrupt. So the Irish Woods formed as a little community, and it had its own school, the Woods School, which you can see on Highway 50 coming west out of Lake Geneva. And so Agnes decided these little children didn't have anything to do all summer. Their parents are working in the estates. They probably would end up working in the estates too. So she started a summer school for the Irish children. She taught them all what they call the homely arts. You know, the cooking, the sewing, the canning, any skill that they might need to get a career when they grew up. When Agnes is also the sister of Renette McCrae that we mentioned just before, another suffragette, and she turned out to be an extremely successful businesswoman. Because when Renette's husband died, Agnes took over. And she ran the business, which was something not many women could do at that time. And then when she passed away and her children did not want, they were her stepchildren actually, but they did not want the house. She donated the entire goods, household goods of the mansion to the place called Holiday Home. And shortly after her death, this house was razed. So we've mentioned Holiday Home a couple of times. And this is Founders Hall. Its purpose, designed by the ladies of the lake, was to serve economically disadvantaged children. The idea started when some of the ladies were out on Emma Ayres' steamer yacht one afternoon on the lake, and they were talking about what a wonderful summer it was and how wonderful it was for their children to be able to have this kind of experience. And isn't it just too bad that not all the children of Chicago could have this kind of experience? So they started Holiday Home Camp. And you can see the women that were involved with this. And they brought children up on the train 2 weeks at a time for the girls, and they'd go home. Next 2 weeks would be for the boys. And the men and the other people around the lake all supported this with money, with food, with bedding, with furniture, with everything that would make these children comfortable. Some of the children of the mansion families were invited over to entertain the children or play with the children. Two of the sisters from the Black Point Estate came over and played violin solos and piano music, and then they'd go out and they'd play games like Kick the Can with the kids. This photo is from Boys Week, and there are a couple of boys here, I think you can see them in the back, on crutches. So even disadvantaged children could come up and be cared for. There were nurses on staff and doctors. Someone told me when I was giving this program that those children were called throwaway children. They just had such a tough life in the city, and especially if they had health problems. One little boy came to camp and never got out of bed for the whole 2 weeks he was there. But he had fresh air, fresh food, fresh dairy, fresh water, and he had 2 weeks that may have improved his health just a little bit. And then the girls came up for a couple weeks, and every mom would send their girl to camp with white linen dresses, right? And they enjoyed the lake just the way all the children around the lake did. They went blue. They played games outdoors, they went swimming, they went for pony rides and fishing and everything else. Has anybody ever seen a game like this? You know that game?
Well,
What call it when
It was dancing the maypole.
dancing the maypole? Okay. Some places called this the giant stride because the idea was to hold on to the ladder and run until your feet came off the ground. So you're taking these giant strides. Other people called them flying steps, I think. And the first ladders were metal. So I'm thinking if you fell or if you let go, you know, you get a ladder of metal in your head. And then I think they changed to rope ladders after a while. So they enjoyed the lake just as much as the boys did.
I didn't realize when I looked up that those were ladders, but you just have May first.
Right, here's the pole down the center. It's very much like the maypole.
Yeah.
And then you have, instead of streamers or ribbons coming down, you have these little ladders that you could hold on to and run until your feet came off the ground. Okay, moving further along the lake, we're past Williams Bay now, and moving toward Fontana. The first estate is called Tres Bras. So that's this one. Away from the lake a little bit is Yerkes Observatory. This was another camp, Camp Collie, and then we have the YMCA camp, which has had many, many names, and Holiday Home is located in there as well. Now the reason we have Tres Bras is because it belonged to Elizabeth Harbert. So look at her name. We have T-R-E, B-R-A-H, Tres Bras. She named it for herself, kind of a code. But she was part of the women's movement as well. She helped found the American Women's Suffrage Association. And she went out with Susan B. Anthony to canvass Wisconsin. Did you know that Wisconsin gave women the vote in 1886, long before that amendment was passed? And Susan B. Anthony was her guest here at the lake. They held intellectual conferences at her home in Williams Bay. Some of this was the outgrowth from the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. They had a World Council of Religion at the same time. So many of these movements came out of the World Congress of Religion. She was college educated. She went to Ohio Wesleyan University, published 3 novels, composed songs, wrote a magazine. She did remarkable things with her life. Camp Collie was, in 1896, the start of what we know as the National Association of Young Women's Christian Association. So the YWCA was getting their start at Camp Collie. It was started as a family camp and grew. Yerkes Observatory, any of you visited Yerkes? Yes? Do you know you can't anymore?
No, I didn't know that.
The University of Chicago decided that they would not sponsor the observatory any longer. So in October of last year, it closed to the public. The building's still there, and as you see, it's under construction right here in about probably 1895, 96. And they had many, many women working here. And these women were called computers. Not the machines, because they were doing it all by hand. They were doing the computations. They crunched the numbers. If you saw the movie Hidden Figures about all the women that worked for NASA, they were doing that at Yerkes. They were doing all the figuring, and they were called human computers. Some of them worked for male astronomers. I don't know if anyone here has been given a star for their birthday. You know, there's always the opportunity you could buy that star, and you know, it would be registered under a certain number, and that's your star. Well, Edith Kellerman developed the star numbering system. Mary Calvert was an assistant and a computer for her uncle, who was the astronomer Edward Emerson Barnard. She became the curator of Yerkes' photographic plate collection and a high-level assistant. There were also jobs from the government. This is the postmistress of Williams Bay, appointed by the President of the United States. And she's delivering mail by horse and buggy out to the observatory. The YMCA camp began to grow. This was the men's camp, but of course we had the women's camp too, and they eventually merged. They welcomed people from all over the world. Back in the 1880s, people came from the Far East. You see these women here. It was very unusual for this to happen, but it allowed people to experience other cultures. It allowed them to learn about the United States, and there were many, many classes held so that there'd be understanding between the countries. This particular building is still on the campus of Aurora George Williams University. Before it became a university, it was Aurora College, so we called it College Camp. Before that, it was the YMCA camp, so there's a lot of names to this place. But this building was called the Women's Building for a while, and it was where Bible study was held. So the men decided they couldn't go to Bible study because it was in the women's building. And they went to play golf next door. But I'm sure there was other Bible study they were exposed to. This happens to be Eleanor Blakesley. She was the first woman to swim the length of the lake. So if you started in Lake Geneva and you swam all the way to Fontana, that's about 7.5 miles. She did it pretty much on a dare. She wanted to attract the attention of a former boyfriend. And so she swam the length of the lake. She didn't get the boyfriend back, but she got recognition as the first person to swim the lake. Now, this was a name I did not know until I started giving this program. Alice B. Stockham is someone all of you ladies should know and appreciate. She was the 5th woman in the United States to become a medical doctor. She specialized in OBGYN, and her platform was women should not wear corsets. So if you're not wearing a corset tonight, thank Alice. That's my pitch for Alice. But when Mary Sturgis came last year over here, she was wearing her corset, so I know what they're like. She also said women should be allowed to enjoy sex. She wrote a book about the wedding night that was very, very specific. And yes, indeed, it was translated into many different languages. She had another one that was called Tocology, a book for every woman. And it was all about a woman's physiology and body. And she took orders for it, and she filled the orders through the U.S. mail. Yes. Well, the U.S. mail decided that this was sending inappropriate matter through the U.S. mail. And so they banned her books. She took it to court. She didn't win. She got a fine of $250, and she could not send her books or publish her books and send them through the U.S. mail. So because of that, she couldn't keep her business going. She had started a camp on Geneva Lake. There's another one. It's called Varelia Heights. And she just couldn't make the camp a go anymore. This was the other camp for women. And she taught them, and she lectured, and she allowed them to swim without their stockings. So between corsets and stockings, this lady was way ahead of her time. Okay, moving to the South Shore now. We come to the estate of Emma Ayer. Emma Ayer's house is right here as the Oaks. And then we have the Yacht Club and Black Point that we want to talk about a little bit too. Emma we remember from Holiday Home Camp as well. She was quite an adventurer. She traveled with her husband through Europe and Asia, and she wrote books about it. A motor flight through Algeria and Tunisia, and she was a swimmer as well. But she didn't swim the length of the lake. She swam the width of the lake, which was a couple miles. And in 2 hours and 10 minutes. Her husband was probably going alongside in the rowboat, you know, make sure she was safe, because you remember what the costumes were like for swimming in the 1890s? They were full-length flannel dresses with stockings and little booties on your feet and a bonnet on your head. And as soon as you got wet, you would sink if you were not a strong swimmer. So he kept an eye on her. She made it across in record time. This was her house, the Oaks. The Ayer family came up from Harvard, Illinois, and established the house, the club, and the camp on the shore. The yacht club started out across the way on the North Shore. They leased property for 10 years, and then when the lease ran out, they eventually bought the South Shore, and it's still located there today. The yacht club has a lot of world-class sailors and ice boaters, and one woman in particular stands out. Her name is Jane Hagel. She was the daughter of a physician in Williams Bay, and she became not only a world-class sailor, but also an ice boater, which astonished many of the men on the lake, because ice boating is fast and dangerous and a very sport requiring a lot of strength. And Jane Hagel managed to do it all.
Speaking about ice boating, my husband's father grew up in Muskegon, Michigan, and they had a big lake, part of Lake Michigan, but it's called Lake Muskegon, you know, like a little bay that comes in. And my father-in-law, every winter would go down to the shore where they were out ice boat racing, and he would, for a certain amount of money, I don't know how much it was, he would sit on the front of the ice boat so it wouldn't like fly up. And he would be going, you know, full speed ahead right on the front.
Right.
But he probably made, you know, 25 cents or something a ride. I don't
Back
know.
in those days, yeah, you had to have the ballast on the
Yeah.
front to keep it. And sometimes when you see photos of the sailing, when they didn't have rudders and so forth, you see the people just hanging off the sides of the boat to try and keep them afloat. So this is Black Point. I have, I think most of you got this little flyer about the house, built in 1888 by a beer baron from Chicago by the name of Conrad Sipe. And he and his second wife, Katerina, had 5 surviving children, 4 girls and a boy. And he built this in 1888 and died in 1890. So only had about a summer and a half to enjoy the estate. But he had this family that loved the house, and his wife Katerina was such a strong matriarch of the family that this has lasted through 4 generations of the family. And so as you come in, if you come on a tour, you come by boat just the way they did back in 1888 to the house, climb about 100 stairs. It's not as bad as it sounds, because there's a flight of stairs and a landing, and another flight and a landing. And so you work your way up the hill, and you get to the top of this beautiful bluff, and you can look out over the lake, especially if you go all the way to the top, which can't be done these days because there's only one entrance, and for public use it has to have an entrance and an exit. So, but you can get up into the 2nd floor on the tour, and occasionally on special events you can get into the 3rd floor. The 2nd and 3rd floor are a lot alike. It's all dormitories, because they had all these children, and through the years more children and cousins, and ended up with many other visitors every summer. And so this was a home for them for all these generations. And it didn't change that much. I mean, now we have indoor plumbing, you don't have to bathe in the lake, and different things have changed. There was one generation where they did have someone who needed assistance going up the stairs, so there's an elevator, but it's hidden in a closet, nobody would ever know it was there. So little modifications have been made, but you can really see a lot of the original house. Conrad left most of his fortune to charity, but Katerina also had control of a lot of the money, and she decided to this was the house in the old days, she decided to sell the brewery. Maybe she had some kind of inkling that Prohibition was around the corner. But she sold the brewery, and she never remarried. She used the money to buy about 100 acres of land and 2,700 feet of shoreline. The land in Geneva Lake is sold by the running foot. So you buy a foot of shoreline and it goes all the way up to the road. But you have to buy many feet in order to get a house in the land up to the road. And today, 1 foot of running shoreline is probably about $30,000 a foot. And she bought 2,700 feet of shoreline. So she brought in an landscape architect from Chicago by the name of Olaf Benson, and he did an extensive plan for landscaping. The Black Point Estate and Gardens today has about 7 acres that can be landscaped. And so you can't do a landscape plan for 100 acres and bring it down to 7. So a different landscaping plan is in progress right now. And you can come and tour the gardens on one of the tours. And it's a simplified but reminiscent of the original plan of Olaf Benson. When she died, here's Conrad and Katerina. When she died, she left a lot of her money to a variety of German associated charities in Chicago. So we're back in the 1880s, 1890s, and we talked about the swimming costume a little bit, but think of what they wore otherwise. I don't know, maybe we have a sense that these Victorian times were so romantic and elegant, but we have to remember they were wearing corsets. The children were dressed very much like their mothers and fathers. Look at how tiny their waists are from these corsets. And that's why Alice Stockman said, this is not good for a woman's body. Even the domestic staff had to be covered from neck to toe and all the way down the sleeves. You can't possibly show any skin, you know. In fact, one of the diaries that we have in the Black Point archives has a note in there from about 1908 when one of Katerina's grandsons wrote, "Today I saw Mary's ankles." So on hot days, people would escape to the water. There's our swimming costumes. And I don't know whether that's the one. Those are the bathing suits. Yes. In fact, one of the other neighbors, Lida Rumsey, talked about swimming in her diary, and she said, "Swimming was the event of the day. It was a real expedition. We rode from the village to the east shore of the lake at the foot of the hill in front of Mr. Young's house." Well, Mr. Young's house is that big concrete stone manor on the lake. Lots of people think it's the Wrigley Estate because it's the biggest one on the lake, but it isn't. It belonged to Otto Young. And she said, "Here we would fasten shawls about the trees to form a shelter for getting into our bathing suits. And I can assure you that they were suits. They were made of heavy blue flannel bloomers, fastened at a waist with long sleeves, cuffs, a turnover collar, a skirt which came well below the knees, all trimmed with white braid. We wore stockings fastened with garters so that by no chance they would come below the bloomers. Years later, when I started to swim across the lake with Brother George in a rowboat, I did take my skirt off before going in the water, but stockings could not come off till I was well away from the shore." Her father was Julian Rumsey, the Civil War mayor of Chicago, and he won the first Sheridan Cup sailing race, the first regatta that was held in honor of General Sheridan coming up to visit from Chicago. But Lida, who wrote this description, was the first woman to bring home a prize in a race of catboats, which are smaller than the full sailboats. It's just one mast, and she won in a little boat called Puckachee. Puckachee was an old Indian word that her father used to use with all 10 of their children Puckachee, puckachee. It meant hurry up. So here's the house from another direction, and you can see over here the outdoor kitchen, the summer kitchen would be separate from the house. There were so many fires on our lake, just because everything had to be cooked on a wood stove, everything was heated in the fireplaces with wood, and the houses were built of wood. So the kitchens were always separate, and then the domestic staff lived above the kitchen, which must have been very comfortable in 90-degree weather. The staff had to prepare all the meals, 3 formal meals a day. Even breakfast was a formal meal. The laundry all had to be done by hand, the house cleaning, and of course, cleaning chamber pots. They didn't have indoor plumbing at the beginning. So that's how it all got started at Black Point Estate. The second generation begins with Emma Sipe, who married Otto Schmidt. She was the pianist that entertained the kids at Holiday Home, and she inherited the house from her mother, Katerina. Her husband, Dr. Otto Schmidt, is the father of yacht sailing on the lake. Now her sister, Alma, also married. She played the violin. She broke many barriers during her lifetime. She was the first woman in the family to go to college. She went to Wellesley, and her parents didn't think she should. So she paid for it all herself. And she went on to teach school in Puerto Rico as a teacher of English for the Spanish-speaking kids. There's another Alma, Emma's daughter. She has a sister Alma and a daughter Alma. And Alma Schmidt Peterson is the granddaughter of Katerina. She was the 3rd generation to have the house. In addition to raising 3 sons, she was contributing to Holiday Home. She was a suffragette, but most of her energy seemed directed toward Hull House, and she received their Distinguished Service Medal. We talked a little bit about Holiday Home Camp, but we also need to mention Hull House in Chicago, and so many of the women around the lake were interested in it. It was founded in 1889 by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr for social, educational, and artistic programs for women. It was organized by women, led by women, formed for social reform, improving the lives of women, and gave the working class people opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. So Alma inherited Black Point. She had 3 sons, and this was the youngest, Bill Peterson. He's the 4th generation, and of course, you might know he married a very strong woman. If you look at his family history of Katerina to Emma to Alma to his wife, Jane, they didn't get married until they were in their 50s, and she was a literary agent in Chicago, having her own career and so forth. But their dream was someday Black Point would serve future generations of people as a museum. And so their dream came true. Jane Jordan Brown Peterson worked with her husband, worked with the state of Wisconsin, took the case to court for 10 years before they eventually were able to donate it to the Wisconsin Historical Society and have an endowment fund to keep it going. And so we honor Jane as the part of the 4th generation that preserved the house for the future. Yes?
What did she have to go to court for?
Well, there was litigation for their potential donation of the house because the neighbors didn't want a museum on the lakeshore where everybody coming through the neighborhood would be in tour buses. So the compromise on that was to come by boat, the way the family did, come up to their own private pier and not disturb the neighbors. There was a covenant made in 1910 that didn't allow businesses to be on the lakeshore. We had a booming ice business in the old days, and there were several ice houses along the shore where you know, the ice harvest would, all the equipment would be stored, and they'd harvest the ice, put it on trains to take, and so there was a covenant to have all these ice houses closed and not have any future business on the Lakeshore Museum would be a business. So there were all of these factors that went into the donation, plus how was it going to be funded? You know, was there going to be tax money for this? The Wisconsin Historical Society? Would it be a 901c3? Would there be an endowment? All of those things had to be settled, and it took 10 years. But finally, it is here. We have a wonderful house museum for you to visit. And we have a couple more women to visit too before we close these last couple of spots. If you watched on television Mr. Sturgis on PBS a couple of years ago, or Mr. Sturgis, Mr. Selfridge, I'm sorry. Mr. Selfridge started out as a clerk in Marshall Field in Chicago, rose to having his own store in Chicago, and eventually moving to London and starting Selfridge's department store. Well, I think the show ought to have been called Mrs. Selfridge, because I think she was pretty special too. She was married to Harry Selfridge. She had her own career until she was about 30 years old. She established what was called Rosalie Villas. She was a land developer in Chicago. She purchased 2 city blocks on Harper Avenue and created this planned community in Hyde Park for an artist colony. She had 42 different little cottages for artists. Their homes looked over the lagoon, the prairie. She built an inn and a cafe. She had, eventually, when the war came, she donated the houses to become a convalescent home and hospital for American soldiers returning from the war. And so she was a pretty special lady. She and her sister both had homes on the lake. Just to back up to her, see her middle name there, her maiden name was Buckingham. The Buckinghams were big on the lake and friends of Sturgis's. They were one of the first ones here. Rosalie Buckingham married Harry Selfridge. Her sister Anna married Frank Chandler. And when the 1893 World's Fair was closing, many of the countries and states did not want to take their exhibits home. It cost too much. So there was this beautiful Buddhist temple replica from the island of Ceylon that was for sale. And there was Anna looking for her husband Frank, who wasn't to be found, so she said, I'll take it. And she bought it, and when Frank came back, she said, I need a few railroad cars to have this dismantled and brought up to Geneva, and that was their home. And her sister Rosalie lived right next door. They just wore a path between their houses. Were pretty special sisters in the very formation of the lake, and in their husbands, and in international affairs as well. Mary Wilmarth is a person who dedicated her life to social and feminist concerns. She was a suffragette. She worked for child labor laws, Holiday Home, Fresh Air Association, all those things we mentioned where many of the other women were involved. And at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, she requested that women be represented as directors of the fair. So a board of lady managers was proposed. Mrs. Palmer, Bertha Palmer, was the director, and she is the one that set up a tea room in the women's building at the fair, and she went back to the Palmer House Hotel that her husband had given to her for her birthday, and she talked to the cooks and the bakers, and she said, I need something sweet to serve with the tea. So in addition to Alice Stockham, we have to thank Mary and Bertha Palmer for inventing brownies. Very first brownies were made in the ovens at the Palmer House Hotel and brought to the fair for the tea room.
Part of the reason for that was so they wouldn't stain white gloves instead of bar chocolate.
Yes, yes, and they did have the bar chocolate, and they also had another machine that would liquefy the chocolate. That happened to be what Mr. Hershey saw when he was at the fair. And he took the idea back. So Mary's daughter, Anna, was also a supporter of all of these kinds of causes, and she was the politician among most of the women we have talked about. She assisted people with college education. She served in the Illinois State Senate in 1928, was on several committees, and her second marriage was to Harold Ikes, I think it's pronounced, or is it? Ikes? Okay, I've heard it both ways. Ikes is somebody I know who has that middle name. Anyway, he was the Secretary of Interior for Franklin Roosevelt, and then she moved to Washington, D.C., and had her time there devoted to culture, archaeology, and welfare of the Native Americans. So we've come full circle. From the first Native American Potawatomis on the lake, back to Anna Ikes, caring for the Native Americans as well. Celia Wallace bought a building at the World's Fair, and she brought it up to the lake. She was called the Diamond Queen because she wore all her diamonds all at the same time. She was very, very good-hearted, but not so good at business. She wanted to open this as a home for orphan boys, but none of them ever moved in, and instead gypsies and tramps and people traveling on the road ended up coming in, and people thought it was dangerous. So the building was torn down, but the logs were still preserved, and they became part of the municipal pier in downtown Geneva. So what women have done in the past, through all these generations, we have more women that can do things for the future. And if you just look through the generations at your own family, at your own lives, no matter what status you're in, if you're a wealthy mansion owner or you're a woman in the Irish woods that wants her children educated, the stories are all remarkable. So I urge you to tell your story to your families. Ask others about their stories of accomplishment, and chances are it'll be just as fascinating as these women, who I would nominate for the Women's Hall of Fame.
All right.
Any questions?
Well, I have one, but it doesn't have to do with Lake Geneva specifically.
That's okay.
Why did some families establish camps and some build these enormous houses?
They were at various times. Lake Geneva really had 3 building periods. First, the town was established, and they established a little business district for the farmers and so forth, and developed a Maple Park and the school for most of the professional people lived in the little original plat of the town. And then, as the land was being sold, there was a period of building the camps and the resorts for people to come and stay. The resorts fell off because of the Chicago fire. People coming out here, staying in the resorts, loving it, and wanting to buy their own land and build their own house. So there was that era of camps and resorts, and then there was the era of the mansion building. So they came at different time periods, and then by now, well, I think we started out with about 18 different camps, and now maybe 7 still exist around the lake. And they're used for different purposes. They were founded for different purposes as well. So,
Did they have a central building where meals were served, and then wooden walkways to the, well, like little cabins, but maybe the boys lived over here and the parents lived off this walkway and the girls would go to there?
well, many of them did have a central administration building and a food service place. Elgin Club, for instance, was a family group from Elgin, Illinois that bought 16 lots, and each one had their own little cabin on it. But because the women were on vacation at Elgin Club, they had a dining hall. And so they had people to prepare and serve the meals for all 16 of the houses in that development.
Okay, so the central kitchen was larger. It wasn't just small for the immediate family.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. But that would be for each individual camp. So Camp Augustana would have their own main building, and the YMCA camp would have their own, and so forth, because they were spread out all around the lake. And the family camps, they would have a little cabin or cottage that the whole family would stay together. For holiday home, it's a big dormitory building. And so there would be all these little dorms for the boys. And then a couple weeks later, the girls would stay in the dorm. And then they'd have the administration and the nurses and the doctors and the food.
Well, I guess part of what I'm alluding to is that I think there must have been a period in American vacation history where those little camps were being built on a lake for a family, not a single family.
Yes. And that was Camp Collie, that first one that I mentioned on Cedar Point. Camp Collie was started just by the Collie family.
Mhm.
He was a minister and he made it for his own family.
Mhm.
But more friends would come to visit and other families would come to visit. He just expanded, and finally opened it to the public.
Because I'm thinking of upstate New York and
Uh-huh.
Saranac Lake, Lake Placid, some of the family camps, small
Right.
little units.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I used to live in Maine,
Okay.
and there, everyone calls their own cabin. Like here, we just say, I'm going up north to my cabin or something.
Right.
There, everyone calls their cabin camp.
Hmm.
That's just the term they use.
Yes.
But I think, it comes from that time period where you would have like even a personal, but they never
Right.
called it cabin, they would call it camp.
Yes, and I know a lot of church camps that just, I'm sure they have cabins and the whole
Yeah.
development, but everybody going says, I'm going to camp. So,
Where did you live?
Do they still deliver mail by boat?
yes, they do. The mailboat is over 100 years old now. A couple of years ago, maybe it was longer than that now, but there was a program on Sunday morning on CBS, I think, that covered the story of the mailboat and the history of the mailboat. And so they'll start up in June and go till September. And the mail starts at the dock at the Riviera in Lake Geneva. They go all along the North Shore and as close to the piers as they can get. And they go very, very slowly. And they have a person on the boat that jumps off the front of the boat, runs up the pier, puts the mail in the mail slot, runs back and hops on the back of the boat. The boat never stops. And sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. And if they're lucky, they have a nice captain that'll make a loop around and pick them up again at the end. But yeah, they still do that. And it's something I don't think exists in any other lake right now.
Has it frozen this winter?
It is so frozen.
Sorry,
It is still frozen. We had Winterfest the first weekend of February. They built an ice castle on the beach.
Oh.
Have you heard of ice castles?
Yeah.
They're in 5 or 6 communities, and we thought ours would never open because we had that unseasonably warm weather for a while.
Yeah.
And then when they did get open, they had to close because it was too cold.
So they didn't have
And so there was the polar vortex, and nobody would come out on the ice for that. And so, yes, we still have.
And then you don't have to worry about cleanup, it just melts.
We're wondering how that's gonna go, because they use city water. It's a real interesting thing. Our Geneva Lake Museum in Lake Geneva has a program called Tuesdays at 2. And they give some of our programs, and they have volunteers come and just talk about all kinds of areas of interest, collections, history, whatever. But they had a man from the ice castles come and give about an hour program on how it was built and, the man that started it and everything. They apparently use some kind of hurricane fence, cyclone fencing, that open wire, and they run it this way, and then they spray this mist all night long, and the icicles form through the fencing. And then they just keep getting thicker and thicker and thicker until they can take them off and make them pillars of the ice castle, and they make rooms and all kinds of things. I didn't get in it this year because they were sold out on the weekends that I was able to go.
So you have to buy tickets, it's
You
you
buy
have
a
to buy in
ticket.
advance.
Yes, it
Okay.
is, yeah.
Were you thinking of snow fence? Is that what
We have a winter fest, and it's
No, fence, the.
Oh, fence.
The form that was built, the ice was built around.
Oh,
Did you, the slats and then they're joined by wire?
no, the wire is just to make the icicles. The whole castle is built of icicles.
She's talking about hurricane fencing,
You know that
stretched
like,
horizontally,
and it
and
has
spraying water on
kind
it.
of like a chain link
There's more
fence.
conversations going, I'm sorry, say it again. Somebody say it
The
again.
chain link fencing or the cyclone fencing has the big holes in it,
Oh,
you know?
it's a
Well, they
metal
put it
fence.
sideways to
Ah.
make the icicles.
Okay, I
And they
understand.
spray this mist all night long and the icicles start forming and they get thicker and then they take them off the fence and they make the rooms. Yeah, it's a real interesting process. It's really interesting. Well, I thank you all for coming. If you have another question or two, I'm here. Glad to talk with you. And we will be scheduled for a couple more Black Point programs this year with a couple other presenters from the Black Point estate. So I hope you'll come out for that.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Why Black Point?
Black Point is actually the deepest part of the lake, very dark, and a point of land that's very, very dark because it's covered in pine trees, all different varieties of pine trees. When the German family built the house, they called it Die Lorelei because of their German ancestry and the German legends and so forth. And then World War I came along and they changed the name of the house. And so they were on Black Point water, Black Point land, and the house became Black Point.
And then I have another question. I've only been out there once, but we walked a section of the lake.
Yes.
And I understand all the homeowners have to grant a right of way. Is that
Yes.
correct? Or-
Thank you for coming. Is there anything else?
I was there once, it's great.
Oh, you should come back. Things, you know, things may be changed, but
Go back to Maine.
Well, we like
Um,
to visit now, but.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Oh,
The walking the path?
Yes, I
It
think
was
that the
really-
homeowners
I
of
bet
the
it's a great
houses
place
on
to
the lake
grow
were
up.
Yeah, well,
Required to.
Yes.
So like 200
Yes,
years,
it is
my
a public
husband and I got
right
married,
of
and
way
we decided to go
all
on
the
an
way
adventure.
around the lake, and it was
Where
established
without
a
any
port because
connections or anything.
one of the
and
mansions
We ended up using this.
blocked off the path on either side of his property and didn't let people go by. This, I think, was back in the 60s or 70s. People would come to that gate and they'd have to go all the way up to the road to get around his house and come back down to get on the path again. And so the citizens took him to court. And it was a one-day trial, and the city won. The homeowner had to take down the gates, pay the court costs, which were about $72 or something. And the judge said this was a right-of-way established by the original owners, who were the Potawatomi.
Oh,
They made
of course,
that.
of course, of course.
And so it went back to them again. It's open all the way around. Yeah, the South Shore is rougher as far as hills and rocks and trees and so forth. So most people recommend if you're going to try and walk the whole lake, it's about an 8-hour trip. But walk the South Shore first when you're early in the morning and you're fresh and energetic, and then it's kind of downhill when you come across the North Shore when you're a little more tired. That's where most of the bigger mansions are, on the North Shore.
What is the geological origin of the lake? Is it a glacial lake?
Yes, 2 glaciers dug the ground, and when they receded and left this basin, it filled with the water. We are a spring-fed lake. We only have one outlet. We have no inlets. And where the narrows are, go back to one of the maps a little bit. The narrows right here are probably where the 2 glaciers met. And so you get freezing from this end, and you get freezing from this end, and you have this buffer zone, and this is where most of the springs are.
Okay.
And then they feed out up by Geneva and go into the White River, which goes to the Fox, which goes to the Mississippi.
And then that triggers another question. What's the water source for Lake, the city of Lakeville? Well, the cities, I guess, around the lake. Is it the lake?
Well, there's a watershed of ground level water, you know, that's, I don't think they can pump water straight from the lake to be our water source. we have a lake level committee that, and we have a spillway that controls the level of the water and so forth, depending on the freezing and the thawing and all of that. One year we had a perfect freeze. It didn't freeze from both ends, it just froze like, what do you call it, fast freezing or something. The whole lake froze at once, so we didn't have that buffer at the Narrows, and it ruined the seawalls and the shorelines around the lake because everything froze at the same time. There was no balance. So,
Early camp pictures used to show just huge stringers of fish and things like that. And you don't get that anymore. You don't see that anymore. Is the fish population in the lake much lower than it was?
well, I don't know if it's much lower than it was back then, but I do know they have a variety of fish. There's always fishing going on in the lake. And for a long time, the lake was stocked with fish. There were fish farms around by where the Abbey is in Montana and so forth. And some of these were provided by the mansion owners, the homeowners that had farm property in different parts around the lake would raise the fish and they'd stock the fish. So,
We'll give you these back and we'll put
okay,
it together.
read together. Thank you. Well, I hope you come visit us this summer.
Yeah, that sounds
I probably
great.
won't be there,
Okay.
but